Welcome again, everyone. And the user group here, thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be here. Third time, I think. Maybe more. Yeah, anyway, nice either way. And a special welcome for all people joining from around the world. Shout out for the folks over in Europe who decided to spend a Friday evening with us. Always nice, of course. Anyone happen to recognize this slide template? Goes back a little bit. It's one of the first time I did this kind of presentations. So MMS 2008. The earliest recollection I can find of this type of session. But to me, it's always been interesting working with ConfigMgr and other deployment solutions to know what's going on behind the scenes, learn the processes, learn the flow, because that allows you to very quickly troubleshoot things or figure out where to inject customizations and stuff like that. And speaking obviously in general, we are in good company in this room as well. I have Mr. Segura right here. We have Mike Terrell. We have Keith Garner. I saw Gary Block lurking online somewhere. Andreas is in the room as well. So I have a feeling there won't be any questions we cannot answer with the combined resources here in the room. But myself, I've been doing this for a long time. I started to do imaging when I was about 16 years old. I was helping a local computer company deploying or putting assembled computers. They had to be deployed with something. I was DOS at the time, eventually became Windows. And I fell in love with automation. Batch files at the time it was, but going into PowerShell eventually. But I've been doing it since. That was a few years ago. Working full-time in IT for 30 years now, so picked up a thing or two, I think. Shorthand version, I love questions. So if you have any, don't hesitate to ask, either online or here in the room. But I figured we could start somewhere. And somewhere is booting up a device on WinPE. But first we need to have one. So ConfigMgr, as you probably know, doesn't include WinPE in its own installation file. It borrows that from the Windows ADK. And the Windows ADK versions right now is a bit of a nightmare. The latest one I don't really recommend using. First of all, it's not supported by Microsoft. Two, there are some hiccups with it. So I recommend to stay on the 22H2 version or the build 22621 that was released about a year and a half ago. That's the one I recommend that you use. But either way, no matter the deployment solution that Microsoft has, it's using WinPE. And if you create your own image or load image, you can actually do that directly from the ADK. So I can go ahead and try to type and get the keyboard to behave.
You have a mic?
Microphone?
Yeah, people are saying that can't hear you.
Somebody bowling in the room?
I can hear you guys. I think there's just a lot of background noise.
There is a fan that I hear in the ceiling, but I don't think we can do anything about it. Hopefully you can hear us.
Greg, you sound great.
Okay.
Johan's a little bit distant, but I think it's just because it's ceiling mics.
These microphones are picking Greg's voice, not there.
Yeah, the ceiling mics are above the audience, not the speaker.
So do I need to get a microphone?
So we can try some if you're having trouble hearing Johan. See if things just work or not.
Sounds like it. Testing.
Oh yeah, that does work. Okay.
Nice. Works for online, nothing.
Cool.
Super quick recap. I'm Johan. I'll be your host. That's pretty much it. Welcome. That was somewhere in there also. But here I have a command prompt. I'm going to go ahead and create a custom boot image. So I'm going to use one of the native commands that exist in ADK. And I'm going to specify an architecture. It's going to be either x64, which is AMD64, or it could be R these days. And I can specify a folder where I want this one to be. See if I can get the English keyboard working. All right. I'm going to call it rank. It will have its own PE image. So now I have boot image. I can make that into a bootable media. There is a command to do that. Make WinPE media, specify I want an item. I specify the folder in question, and I specify a folder to which I want to have that ISO created and made bootable.
Hey, Johan. The audio got way worse.
All right.
Is it on?
It is on.
I think you might, I don't know if you can turn off the room mics maybe and just have it be the lapel mic. Is there an option to do that?
Should be able to mute the mic.
Who knows?
Muted him earlier.
Still can hear me okay?
Barely.
Very weird audio. Okay. Here we go. Let me see.
Testing.
Testing,
Yep.
testing.
Turn on testing. I am testing. Any better? The folks that are online?
Everybody else?
Eh, 5 out of 10.
Done.
Did it get better? I'm turning up the.
Testing. Continue testing. Still working on Greg's boot image here.
If you're eating the mic like that, it does work.
Let's get out of this and then different here.
Testing. How about now? Bad?
Yeah. Hello, ready?
9 seconds.
Hello?
Yeah, it seems okay.
Okay.
Not
Very
playing.
good. You
How
think?
much anything we'll see? Yeah.
All right. Try again. Anyhow, creating a boot image.
Clear, we're not working.
It's coming bootable. And I can take a virtual machine and you will see something very exciting. Go to clean snapshot. And I'm going to mount that ISO on that virtual machine. Or in that virtual machine. My ISO folder. Find the Greg ISO that I just created. Greg PE. Gonna boot it up. This is a UEFI-based machine. I wasn't quick enough to press any key. There are quite easy way to not having to do that. You can change the loader of the boot image to not ask questions. But this is it. This is what you get when the default boot image starts up. Get a command prompt. If you're lucky, you got an IP address. So question is, it doesn't look like this when you boot a ConfigMgr boot image. Why is it different? Well, ConfigMgr obviously adds a lot of stuff to the boot image. But there are also stuff that you can add yourself to the boot image. If I would boot up an old-fashioned MDT boot image on the same virtual machine, I happen to have one of those here. So same VM, just going to pick a different boot image, restart, and try to hit that one. So while we're waiting for that one to boot, I do have a post on my blog. Search for quiet. There is a post saying a good ISO file is a quiet ISO file. But long story short, if you don't like having to press any key when you boot, you can use a little bit of PowerShell and just provide a different boot entry for it. Because there is one in the EFI that is asking, or rather, not asking any questions when it starts. So you have an ISO, you run this script, you get a new ISO that doesn't ask for questions. So post there. So as you can see, this boot is behaved a little bit different. This is a fun memory of mine during the System Center Universe conference back in 2015, and every speaker got tasked with a
to put in something from Star Wars into their presentation. And this was my way of doing it. I put the background from the Millennium Falcon doing it, jump in space. So I kept that one since 9 years ago. Time flies. Anyhow, I have a little remote desktop session waiting here in the left corner that allow me to remote into devices. If the server is running that this one is supposed to connect to, it should be able to do so. And here I see my different sequences. Now, if I open up a command prompt on this boot image and look in the root of that command prompt, you will see something that is different. You will see an Unattend.xml file. If you look in that Unattend file, type it out, you will see there are a few things that are happening here. Try to set the screen resolution. Works okay in virtual machines, does not work so well anymore on physical hardware because of more modern resolutions. But you can do see here that it launches a script. This is how that wizard was starting in the background. There was an Unattend file in the root of the boot image that started a script that launched the wizard. Now, if you really want to set screen resolution in WinPE, the good way for modern hardware, we have David's solution here. Go to his OSD Cloud PowerShell module. There are 4 functions that you can borrow, and that will allow you to set the screen resolution in WinPE, even on modern EFI-based or UEFI-based hardware. Now, the question is, okay, why could it be useful to know this when you work with ConfigMgr? Well, imagine you want to do something before ConfigMgr knows about anything. For example, remoting into devices for troubleshooting. The way the native implementation for remote access in WinPE is done in ConfigMgr, and that's when you have the integration with MPT. There is nothing by default. It launches it 2 minutes after you have selected the sequence. What if you actually need to remote into device to do some sort of troubleshooting? Even maybe select the sequence. Well, you need to start it early. This is a way of starting it early. So I have a blog post on that as well. If you search for Dart, you will find a post that has a PowerShell script that adds it to the boot image and starting it early and early so that you can even type in the password before you be able to see your sequences. And then you have remote access to that machine. What if you don't have Dart? It's part of the Microsoft Desktop Optimization Pack. It's part of software assurance. Not everyone has licenses for it, but you still want to remote into devices for troubleshooting in WinPE. Well, you need a friend. Like Gary. Because Gary has a website, garytown.com. If you search for VNC on that one, you will find that he has guides on how to add in both Dart and VNC to WinPE. And that also allows remote access into the machines in the WinPE. And then finally, we have our friends over at Mesh Central. The gentleman from Intel working on this product. But this one also works in WinPE. It's open source. You can use it to go into WinPE. Word of caution on this little friend is that it is using Node.js. So make sure you get those libraries from trusted sources, because there have been some incidents over the years, security ones, that you don't want to have in your platform. But what I like about the VNC and the Mesh Central solution is that they work with repeaters. So you can have machines behind an NAT gate. You can still see them or access them. Dart requires line of sight. Anyhow. Now, then we have Michael Niehaus, who is the Hector's row here in the room. He put together a little blog post 4 years ago, 3, that explains exactly how the startup process is in WinPE. So you want to learn a little bit more behind the scenes, what actually goes on, I recommend reading this one. So good resource. But going back to my notion here on the boot image, why is it useful to know? Well, so I can put in things during deployment and fix things that might happen. I put together a blog post a little while ago on, see if I can find it. Building the perfect ConfigMgr boot image. A lot of this was from research from 7-8 years of doing imaging with ConfigMgr. But for example, this was a problem we often ran into. Still see it from time to time on high latency networks, but it was basically an error message that happened. If you have been working with imaging for more than 4 minutes of your life, what do you think an error message like this means?
Driver error.
Drivers, yeah, says so, right? Probably drivers. It wasn't drivers. We spent 4 hours troubleshooting drivers. No? It was the network team. They forgot to enable port fast on some of the switch ports in that location. This was a conference in London. And it took 7 seconds for the machine to get an IP address. WinPE did not like that at all and gave us this error rather than the real error. Time was of an essence. I could not have them fix the switches over the weekend, so we had to fix it elsewhere. So long story short, we added an Unattend file to the boot image before ConfigMgr knew about anything. And we ran, at the time, the VB script. Feel free to convert this to PowerShell if you like. And that's a script I'm very proud. It's a lot of work. We waited 10 seconds because then the machine got an IP address and we can continue. I've seen organizations using techniques like this if they have, say, Linux on device and they want to image Windows to it, and Windows gets confused or ConfigMgr gets confused about the partitioning layout. They just throws an error and say, hey, I don't want to do this. So you can prompt for wipe the disk, get rid of the partitioning table so you can continue. I've seen organizations have that as a standard option. They have a little front end, they pop up, and there is an option to wipe the disk. But if you do this early, well, then you can hook in and mitigate resources or mitigate issues that may happen in the process. Now, if you want to interact with ConfigMgr variables, you cannot do that this early. You can only do non-ConfigMgr stuff this early. If you want to interact with ConfigMgr, you have to wait until the pre-start feature kicks in the startup process. It's not enabled by default. You can enable it on a boot image. It's a checkbox, and you can add some files to it. But long story short on that one, ConfigMgr places an ini file in the root of your boot image called tsconfig.ini. And you can have that config file do whatever. But at that point, we have access to the full variables list. And you can change them. So for example, in ConfigMgr, it's not uncommon to see an error message like no policies found. That could be that you simply forgot to deploy your sequence. It could be that you deployed it to unknown computers and the machine you're deploying is actually known, but it could also be latency on the network. The machine is not finding policies from ConfigMgr quick enough, and then it throws you this error. So what you very easily can do is put a script, not terribly complicated. PowerShell or VB script work just fine. This happened to be VB script. But you can tell it to try a few more times and put an interval in between each retry. I don't mind adding this always to a ConfigMgr environment because it's only going to retry if it couldn't find it on the first attempt. And if it couldn't, you kind of want it to retry. So if you start to see issues where you're doing deployments and sometimes you get this error, by knowing what's going on behind the scenes, you can quite easily fix it. Now, if I would take the same machine here and boot on a ConfigMgr boot image, still from ADK, but it's going to behave differently. Copy. And I have the computer picking it. If I open up a command prompt on this one and take a look in the system, I'm going to bump up the font size in just a second here. So it's a ConfigMgr boot image has a file in the Windows System 32 folder. It's called WinPE shell.ini. That's one of the options you have to launch something different when the boot image starts. This is even before the Unattend file is processed. ConfigMgr team is using that to launch their own boot shell. They didn't like what WinPE came with, so they added their own one. They have their own network logic in it. And I can see David James just joined here. Why no? They wanted to improve. That was the word I was looking for. Opportunity for growth. Anyhow, so that one is kicking on its own boot shell, where they have additional options. And this one also has its own configuration file. Since this is a media, I can go to the D drive and I can go to SMS and data. And this is where you find 2 ini files here. Oh, sorry, 1 ini file. It's a Windows folder that has 2 of them. But this one here tells the characteristics on how the boot shell should work. Have we enabled unattend, true or false? Do we require a password, true or false? Is it a boot media? Yes, it's boot media. And it reads that information and uses. So when you create a boot image, depending on what to select in the checkboxes, it creates different inputs when you create the media. But from this point on, I can go ahead and launch a sequence. In this case, I'm using a pre-start command for setting a background image, playing around with variables. So they obviously always exist on standalone media. This is a boot media, so I don't have them. In theory, it should show me a sequence. So I can go ahead and start the deployment of something. Why not a trustworthy? Let's see what I have. Let's go Windows 11. Have to be there somewhere someday anyway. So I'm asking for a computer name. You don't have to do that, of course, but it's easy in a lab environment. So just throw up a prompt, a name, and then deployment starts. Now, in this environment, I have enabled debugging so that I can very easily step through the various actions I have in my sequence. And as I do this, you will see variables updating in real time here at the bottom. I found this very useful for troubleshooting. I can even put in a breakpoint and say, you know what? You can go all the way here. So I'll set the breakpoint here, and then I hit run, and it runs through steps all the way to that breakpoint, and that's done. Question is, this one is not enabled by default, and there are a few different ways to enable it. Mike has a little neat trick, creating a folder that has the word debug in it, and it will launch it. But most folks are enabling it through a variable. It can be done on any collection. In my lab here, I have most of my sequences deployed to the all unknown systems or all unknown computers collection. So if I do properties on that one, and hit collection variables, this is where you can see that I'm using that to toggle this wizard or this debugger on and off. So very easy to enable for production and then turn it back on again. You can of course do it in a resource if you have it pre-staged, but this has been working fine or working good for me. So that's a little bit what happens in the early process of a boot image and how you can implement routines to make that better, more resilient. But what about Pixie? What if you do network boots? And you are happen to be lucky enough to work for an organization that allows it. Not everyone does that. Most do, but not everyone. Well, the good news for ConfigMgr admins in general is that most Pixie issues are not your fault. It is often something that the network team messed up with. Most companies that I work with are using IP helpers to tell the clients where to go to. You can use scope options, a bit more complex, but it works as well. The problem is, even though it's not your job, you are often the one that has to prove to the network team that it's their fault. Now, obviously, you have to see to your own house first. So there are a few things you need to check. First of all, the boot image that you're using, is it enabled for Pixie? Yes or no? Is it in fact distributed to the distribution point having the Pixie service running or the responder running? The sequence that you're using, whatever sequence that may be, is it configured to use that boot image? Yes or no? And your deployment that you had, if you had any, see if I can find my Windows 11 one that I showed earlier. That particular deployment, does it allow media and Pixie? But let's assume that you did all that. Check the boot image, it is deployed, you have distributed it, the settings are right, and it still fails. Well, if you're lucky and have a network that looks like this, may have a few remote Pixie servers, or at least one, and it works on one location, but it does not work on this location here. What are the likeliness in this case that it's your Pixie server or DP that is misconfigured? If you only have one and it works over here but not over here, it is not very likely. The network team most likely messed up. Now, what you can do real quick, and this is something I use, I wouldn't say every day, but close, because TwoPint, as you probably know, we sell Pixie servers, and Pixie is Pixie, no matter who does it. We need to troubleshoot them as well. So Andreas here, he put together a neat little script. We have it on our GitHub repository. I can find that one. So no, I do not want to confirm my MFA right now, thank you. If you go to the iPixie Anywhere repository, there is a Pixie troubleshooter. It's a little PowerShell script that pretends to do a Pixie boot without doing a Pixie boot. So I can go to any given client that I have in my environment, and I can get a sort of a lay of the land. How am I doing here? So if I go to one of these devices, this is just a regular Windows 10 device, and I run the script. Is this good or bad? Only getting one message back when I try to do a Pixie boot. Not really. I want more than one. This is not too bad because at least I know, okay, I got an IP address, fantastic. You're going to need one of those anyway. but I didn't get any information on where to pixie boot from. So if I go to a different client that is on a different network, like this one here, run the exact same script, I start to see multiple messages coming back to me. This one is more interesting because this is the Pixie server. I still don't see the boot file yet here, but I could have. The point is I'm receiving multiple messages on different servers. One of them is my DHCP server, one is my Pixie server. So this is just usually a quick way to establish that at least there is some configuration going on. If you want to go a little bit more behind the scenes, Hyper-V is quite powerful in the way that you can take a virtual machine, or rather install Hyper-V on a device here, and install a VM on it, Wireshark on it, or whatever capture software you like to use, and you can monitor the traffic between a client and the Pixie server. Because in Hyper-V, you have the option. I'm going to start up that machine for you. On the VM, in the network stack or in the network settings, you can ask it to do port mirroring on a switch, virtual switch. And you can say this one is the destination. Then you can go to another machine, a test client, same switch, and you configure this one to be a source. So when you pixie boot in this VM, you can see exactly what's going on between that client and the Pixie server. And even if you haven't seen a network trace in life, they are not very big. If you filter on the WinPE protocol, it's going to be like 15 packages or so. I've used this a lot over the years to prove that something is off on the network. Let me bring up that machine. Type in the right password. I'll open up a saved trace that I had. This was a capture from a customer that I visited a few years back. Pixie was working in every location but one. That location was using the same distribution point as everybody else, but it didn't work. Seeing this trace here, do you have any idea on why it didn't work? Anything stand out in this trace here? You don't have to be as old as I am to get it, but you have to be a little bit old.
Somebody online said the temporary IP.
Oh, Altiris. Remember Altiris? It's a deployment solution from the dark ages, the back in the days. Eventually swallowed by Symantec, and of course, what happens when stuff goes to Symantec? It's like a Broadcom, but then. No, this customer had been using Altiris many, many years ago. It was decommissioned. And they were using ConfigMgr now. Except on this location, they forgot that there was one Altiris server left behind. Picking up the request, obviously couldn't do anything with it because the rest of the Altiris infrastructure was gone. But without a trace, I would never have figured out that there was something else picking up the request. I can only see it didn't contact the DP. Well, that was the server that picked up it instead. Because in general, if you have multiple pixel servers on the same subnet, they're going to argue. And the one that responds the quickest responds the quickest. I kind of miss the feature that Microsoft had back in the days. It was developed specifically for MSIT. And I blogged about it in a blog I had also a while ago. Deploy Vista. I had high hopes of Vista. Didn't turn out to be so good, but I kept it as an archive because I tried to turn it off. I got yelled at. A lot of people are apparently still reading these old blog posts. But back in the days, for Windows deployment services, there was a registry key you can add that says allow server selection. And this is something I recommend if I mean, it's Friday after all. If you are out of things to do in a weekend, you can download Procmon from sysinternals, and you set it to a filter for a service of choice, in this case, Windows deployment services. And then you start the trace, and you restart the service. And you look for what registry keys and other things that service looks for. The most interesting ones is the ones that they're looking for but couldn't find. So in this case, it was looking for this key, but it couldn't find it. And they're like, what if I add that key? I was guessing you should set it to 1. But then you can press F11 instead of F12. And then you can actually pick up, get a list of local pixel servers on your subnet. How they gathered this, I have no idea, but they had it. Sidebar, but you shouldn't have multiple pixel servers on the same subnet. Try to avoid that. If you absolutely must do some sort of chaining, use a menu that can redirect them to different systems. Some of our customers, for example, they have a pre-prod environment and they have a production environment, but they want to be able to very easily select in between the two. So they add in menus to the Pixelboot process so they can select pre-prod or production or whatever they're doing, because that's not terribly complicated to do. But let's assume for the sake of argument here, we were able to boot. We were able to pick a sequence, and that sequence started to download an image, apply it to the hard drive, and hopefully with a bit of peering, but it got the image down. And then it's about injecting drivers. I hate to break it to you, even for Windows 11, you're gonna need drivers. The vendors are slowly catching up. There are upcoming announcements the upcoming week that you should pay attention to on Thursday. I'll look online on Thursday. Anyhow, the drivers are involved in this mix, but how does the sequence actually do it? What is the flow here? I remember back in the early days of ConfigMgr, and I mean, not mean SMS here, I mean ConfigMgr 07. Microsoft used to publish superflows, they call it, like flowcharts, everything that happened in what order, and then that stopped for whatever reason, but I miss those. They were absolutely great. But what is the flow for drivers? How does the sequence actually do it? Well, step number 1, it's going to copy the drivers. To the client, down to the hard drive. I do not recommend using the legacy methods of I have 3 levels of driver management. See if I can get this one going here. The first level is what I call the Jurassic era, where you actually created driver packages, imported drivers into the console and created packages from them. Don't do that. Then there was this second era where organizations found that, instead of creating driver packages, it's better to create packages with drivers. So regular packages, but they contain drivers. But they were unextracted. This is the legacy era. And the legacy era also goes into having a sequence where you hard code which model that should have which package. The modern era is where you have, I go to the data source from one of these packages. WIM file. This particular WIM file is about a gig, 960 megs. If I open that in 7-zip, because 7-zip can deal with WIM files, you can see that the original size was almost 3 gigs. And a lot of small files. From a network point of view, it is quite terrible to download a few thousand small files, especially over internet-based HTTPS type connections. It's way more effective to put them into a WIM file, download the WIM file, and then mount it on the client to inject the drivers from it. And instead of having, I think I have one that I called legacy just for the fun of it. Let me see, I have a lot of sequences. As you do. Yeah, legacy, that works. So basically, this model, this package, this model, that package, with conditions and whatnot. That's the legacy. The modern way of doing things is to have a single action in the sequence that queries the admin service for the package, asking, hey, I'm this model, what package do you have available for me? And it will automatically pick it. And this one you can configure so it works on both on-premises and on Cloud Management Gateway. Because there are variables in ConfigMgr, it knows if your client is on internet or not. So if the client is on internet, I'm simply connecting it to the internet endpoint of my CMD. Whereas if I'm on my own network, my corporate network, I'm connecting directly to my local management point that I have access to. But this is how I recommend dealing with drivers these days. Put them into WIM files and put in logic that will automatically download and use them. Much, much simpler. And for example, these driver packages that I showed you earlier, I did not create these packages. I was using a PowerShell script to do it. A very large PowerShell script. A 20,000 line large PowerShell script. This is the PowerShell script. It's a driver automation tool, community-driven tool that you can download and use, but it's really just a large PowerShell script. But you simply pick your platforms, you pick your models, you hit enter, and it will download and create the packages for you. If you absolutely want, create manual packages, or you happen to work with vendors that are not supported by the tool, by all means, go ahead and do it. But it's just a quick way to create packages. And then use the script to assign. But back to the flow. The sequence will copy down the driver packages, or package, depending on whatever method you used. And then the second step that will happen after that is that the sequence will stage the drivers. Yeah, stage them where? Takers? Into the driver store. The offline driver store. ConfigMgr MDT does a little bit differently. ConfigMgr has their own little component that does the injection. MST is just using this, but they inject drives into the store. Then the device reboots. And it will come up in, so these steps here, they are in WinPE. But after reboot, we are obviously up in full Windows. In Windows, setup, not the sequence, setup itself in the specialized path. It's going to install the driver from the store. This is the flow. Now, is there much point for you guys to troubleshoot step 2 or 3 if the drivers were never copied in the first place? Or it's not. But unless you know the order of things, you don't really know where to start. But now you know where to start. So how will you troubleshoot step number 1 here? Now when you know what step number 1 actually is. With the log file. SMSTS log file. What's the challenge with this log file? It jumps around 4 different locations. So depending on when it fails, you may have to hunt it in different locations there. But usually, since we are doing imaging here, you will find it on the X drive early in the process. It's likely to be in that folder, X colon Windows temp, etc. So one of the challenges is jumping around. The second challenge is the size. What's the maximum size by default for this log file? If it's not allowed to answer. It used to be 1 back in the days, now it's 2 megs. How much content will a somewhat medium-sized sequence generate? In a non-PKI environment, start with that one, yeah?
So a lot.
Well, say non-PKI 5, PKI maybe 20, but say it's just 5. You don't need to go to any higher, education or learn about algebra and stuff to learn. It's hard to have 5 megs of content and try to squeeze it into 2 meg container. It will not fit. So what happens is when it reaches the maximum limit, it's an archive, and then another archive. So now you have 3 files that you need to merge and look for drivers. What I recommend is bump up the size a little bit. So how do you do that? Well, I am happy that you asked. I wrote a post back in the days, understanding logging in ConfigMgr OSD. But the shorthand version is that if you place a file named this in the Windows folder of your boot image, you can control the size. You can control the size and you can control the bug logging, yes or no. Fun fact is that back in ConfigMgr 07, some point in the early years there, year 1 or 2, one of the developers enabled the bug logging by default. And it's been that way since. That's probably a good reason. What? It's for the offline, I think it's a TS Core DLL that it's being called, but it's the lightweight agent that exists in WinPE. I still call it an agent. It's not a thing. Yeah. But this one controls that behavior of the log file. So in this case, I bumped up to 16 megs because I rarely see log files being larger than that. If you want it to stay the same size when the ConfigMgr client eventually gets installed, absolutely yes, you will have to go into your sequence and you have to tell it to do it there as well. But the thing is, most issues for OSD happens in the WinPE phase. So I usually only need it there. But if you want it longer, you can add it longer. Now, a little bit hard to see this screenshot, but this is basically a comparison to having the bug logging enabled and not enabled, disabled, however you say it. What you will find is that if you disable the bug logging, you often have enough info for troubleshooting, but in smaller log files. Mike Terrell recently alerted me on the benefit of doing this if you are in a PKI environment, because there is a lot of certificate information coming down and it loads the log files, making them hard to read. So you can simply go ahead and disable it. So, because if you disable it, you will find that it usually fits within that normal size, unless you're doing a lot of stuff. But, yeah. So check the log file, find out where it is, have it increased in size, and it's easier for finding out stuff. Now, you can also go wild and crazy, you can search for the file. If you cannot find the file on the hard drive, setup is going to have a hard time to use it. What about this one? How can you troubleshoot step number 2? There is a downside to not importing drivers in ConfigMgr. You don't get any validation of them. Trust me, this step will tell you if there is a non-good driver. But where do you find information about it? There's a log file. System.log will tell you whether it could or could not stage a driver. And the final piece then. There's a setup api.dev.log file. It used to be called setup API only back in the XP timeframe, so 2003 and whatnot. This one is your friend. You may see another one. May, I say because it's not always. It's called setup api.setup.log. It's apparently supported for developers to, when they write driver, to log to that one also. I just don't see it done very much. But this one will tell you why a driver could or could not be installed. And it goes all back to driver ranking. How Windows tried to figure out what driver to pick. I'm not going to spend time on the algorithm because it's going to take a while. But long story short, if I open up such log file from, say, a Windows 10 or Windows 11 device, you're going to find they're fairly big. But if you search for this one or search in this file, and you found that setup only found one matching driver, there's going to be little argument on what driver it will pick. But if you find entries where it says, oh, I actually found 2 drivers that were a good match, it's going to only pick one of them. It's going to pick the one that has the best score, the best ranking score. Low is winning. So by reading this information, you can force or figure out why a driver was not installed. Microsoft purposely made their own drivers bad. They give them a very high ranking score. So they will lose by design against the vendor's driver. This is a problem now when we start to do Windows 11 upgrades, because sometimes you need to remove a driver in order for it to pick an inbox driver. Because even if you feed it with a third-party driver that is 7 years old, its score is going to be better and Windows is going to pick it. But that was following the white rabbit, obviously from Matrix, but following the processes during OSD. I have a quick break now, I believe, Greg.
Yeah, I see one question for you, Johan. Do you use OSD injection.xml for improvements on boot image files?
I do not, and the reason I don't do that is I can open the file if it's with the frame. Yeah. So in the ConfigMgr installation folder, see if I have it on this system. This one here, OSD injection XML, contains a list of the stuff that ConfigMgr always add to the boot image. I've seen companies editing this one. Problem is, it's not supported for first. Second is, a future update of ConfigMgr may overwrite this one, and you lose the changes that you had. And it could be even worse. It could detect that you have updated the file, so it's newer, so it's not going to put in the new file that is needed for that new version. So I don't, in general, recommend touching this file, but sure, it will do the job. I think it's just easier to have a PowerShell script that mounts the image, smacks in the file, and closes it. Because if I go to any given boot image, there will always be two versions of it. Gonna be a small one and a big one. Small one is that the one you want to modify. That's a template. The small one is always created. Or the bigger one. I hope that answers the question.
Any more questions?
I had a question just about the driver thing. Do you see, I guess, the setup phase driver problems? Is that mostly during upgrades, or do you still see that? I mean, I'm trying to think of reasons other than, conflicting drivers. Is there drivers that just fail to install still? I mean, is that still like a big?
Happens every now and then, even from the big vendors where drivers are not okay and they fail to be injected even. That's usually when you see it first. But I mean, driver is going to be in one of four states. Either you're going to do nothing, that whatever works you had works. Otherwise, you have to update prior to an upgrade. You can update during upgrade, or you can remove, so it will pick an inbox driver instead.
Right.
The only way to find out is test.
Luckily, I do clean. I don't do upgrades.
Well, one of those lovely, it depends.
Yeah.
I worked with a good over 100 customers from 7 to 10.
Right.
3 of them did in-place upgrades. That means 117 or so did bare metal deployments. I don't see the same for Windows 11. I see more organizations doing in-place upgrades, even though it's a nice idea to flatten the state and start over. Especially since we learned that there is no Windows 12. There will be a 24 H2 Windows 11 in this fall. There will be new shiny drivers for that one too. No, it's not going to be an EKB. That's a fully in-place upgrade. Congratulations.